Sorry, I forgot my water and I smoked an enormous amount of pot before I got here. Horrible guy. I knew you guys would give me such a nice podium. I wouldn't have worn pants. First of all, I want to say thank you all very much for having me here. This is a real treat. I've been to New Mexico only once before, a couple summers ago. Stayed up in Taos for about a week. My wife and I, we drive cross country every summer. It's a great thing for a pundit in Washington to do, just to realize how big this country is and how few people really give a rat's ass about Washington. And we stayed up in Taos and wasn't quite prepared for the culture shock. I was expecting it to be sort of, I knew it was going to be hippie-ish, but it was going to be sort of like body shop hippie, with organic food and clever soap and that kind of thing. And instead it was more Charles Manson hippie-ish. And lots of kids running around without shoes. And I think some of Barack Obama's friends from the Weather Underground are still hiding out there. Anyway, again, I want to say thank you all very much. It really is a great pleasure for me to be out here. The Rio Grande Foundation and the New Mexico Prosperity Project, these are really important organizations. They do great things. I'd like to talk about the role of think tanks and organizations like this. It's sort of like the Irish monasteries during the Dark Ages in Europe. They keep the light of civilization alive until the masses are ready to receive it. And then they go forth and explain that free markets actually work and whatnot, and it's an incredibly important role. I'm also just flattered that you guys could be here. I know this isn't the $28,500 Barbra Streisand sort of thing, which I actually bring up for one key point in Vic's very generous introduction. He left out the fact that when the LA Times picked me up as a columnist, Barbra Streisand publicly canceled her subscription to the LA Times in protest. And if I were in show business, I would just walk off the stage at that point because you got to leave on a high note. It doesn't get much better than this. I know the election's in a lot of people's minds. I was invited to come here to talk about the book. I'll try to do both. Hopefully Q&A. Completely understand if you guys don't want to get into Trotsky's theories of right-wing socialism and instead want to talk about the latest Rasmussen poll. Delighted to do that. But I think there's some themes in my book that are sort of important and pertinent to what we're seeing today, and I want to sort of focus on those. And I think one good sign about how pertinent they are today is the reaction they've gotten from people who didn't like the message of the book. It was an incredibly grueling book tour. I think Keith Olbermann called me the worst person in the world 3 times. I don't think he realizes that I'm such a pain in his ass because it's the fastest route to his brain. I was the first author in the history of Amazon to have his webpage hacked several times. They took the picture of the book and replaced it with a picture of me and a Hitler mustache. And it was actually one of the nicer things that they did. I've been heckled, I've been booed, all that kind of stuff. I haven't been pied. Like all of my friends have been pied. Bill Crystal gets pied, Ann Coulter gets pied, Michelle Malkin gets pied on one of these college campuses. And no one pies, no one's throwing pie in my face. And, I have these daydream fantasies about becoming this helicopter fists and beating up some patchouli soaked activist when he comes at me with pie. But so far it hasn't happened. So I don't have time to lay out all the arguments in my book. Those of you who read it know it's got a lot of stuff in there. The general theme, the general point of the book is to debunk what Tom Wolfe says in a blurb of the book was the greatest spin of the 20th century, which is this idea that fascism was a right-wing phenomenon. It simply wasn't. Fascism and communism, we were taught from the earliest days of civics class in high school, are opposites, right? But they're not opposites. As Richard Pipes, the intellectual historian from Harvard, put it a long time ago, fascism and Bolshevism aren't opposites. They're both heresies of socialism. They both come out of the socialist tradition. They're part of the socialist tradition. One of the things a lot of people here, including a lot of people on the right, believe this, is this idea that fascism and communism, sure, they're really similar, but that's because the political spectrum's really like a circle. you know, and that the further right you move, the more like left it is, and the further left you move, the more like right it is. And, you know, you can get these sort of tweety college professors with elbow patches to draw a circle on the board, and, you know, and it's the same trick at all times, because they always put themselves, their own political ideology, in the exact opposite of all bad things, right? Just the same way that the communists say that define fascism as evil and then say it's the opposite of us, right? Liberals say fascism and communism are both evil and it's the opposite of me. And and this whole idea, which is what de Tocqueville would call a clear but false idea. It sounds persuasive, but it actually makes no sense. Nowhere else in life do we talk about extremes meeting. We don't say something is so hot it's cold. We don't say something is so tall it's short. We don't say something is so fat it's thin. The only exception I've been able to come up with in years of looking at this is we do say that bulldog puppies are so ugly they're cute. Right? But beyond that, we never talk about extremes meeting, and yet when it comes to politics, we're supposed to believe that something can be so right-wing it's left-wing, which is in fact nonsense. And this has always confused me. You know, my heroes growing up, first of all, starting with my dad, but you know, William F. Buckley and George Will, Irving Kristol, all of these guys, I grew up on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, right? Which makes it seem like, you know, I don't know, the Taos is a bastion of right-wingers. You know, we were like Christians in ancient Rome. And, you know, you would go to the Central Park and draw a little C in the dirt. You know, you're conservative too, and you cross it out. Meet me in the catacombs under Sabars. And I could never figure out why my heroes were called the fascists, right? I mean, libertarianism, just pure and simple, is the quintessential, ontological, metaphysical opposite of all totalitarianisms, right? I mean, the idea of radical individualism, where no authority on you whatsoever, cultural or political, is the opposite of totalitarianism. And American conservatism basically believes in two things: the sort of classical liberal libertarian vision and the sort of traditional moral values, wisdom of the ancients, importance of religion, family values, whatever you want to call it. These are the two pillars of American conservatism. And it's why the original project of National Review was fusionism, to marry these two traditions. Free markets and free ideas plus traditional values equals conservatism. And it was these two traditions that the fascists, the socialists, the communists, the national socialists, they all rejected that entire thing. They hated Manchester liberalism and they hated traditional morality. And yet, we have been stuck, the right has been stuck with the label fascist ever since. And it's amazing, you know, you go around on college campuses. I remember before I even started working on this book, one of the reasons I wrote the book was I would go on these college campuses and I would be talking about tax cuts or something, and these kids would call me a fascist. And you know, and it was usually one of these kids, you know, with open-toed shoes and a closed mind. And you know, I would say to them, you know, look, can you explain to me, you know, except for the murder, bigotry, genocide, and war, what is it exactly about Nazism you don't like, right? And they would look at me the same way my basset hound used to look at me when I tried to feed it a grape. Just total unblinking incomprehension. You know? And then I would go on to point out about how the fascists and the National Socialists, you know, were environmentalists. They were the first green movement. They were the first youth movement. They were socialists. You know, it's amazing how many people don't understand that the National Socialists were socialists. Gregor Strasser, one of the founding ideologues of National Socialism, put it pretty succinctly. He said, "We are socialists." He went on to say, "We are enemies, deadly enemies of today's capitalist economic system with its overemphasis on wealth as the moral, you know, as the moral worth of a human being, blah, 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 blah." The first speech that attracts Adolf Hitler to the Nazi Party is titled, "How and by what means shall capitalism be destroyed?" Adolf Hitler despised traditional religion, despised Catholicism, wanted to ban it from society and replace it with a political religion that put him as the redeemer and the Messiah figure in German life. And so I go through all that kind of stuff, but we're not going to do that. If you want to ask me questions about that afterwards, I'd love to. What the second major argument of the book is that, well, let's put it this way. There are two ways to test this, right? One is just sort of purely argumentative, theoretical, von Misesian. I just simply say, hey, here's what they said, here's what they did, here's the arguments that they made. that's left-wing, right? If we define left-wing as a social welfare state, the idea that the state comes before the individual, confiscatory tax rates, using politics to determine the role of the market, all of these sorts of things. If you define those things as left-wing, and if you define traditional morality and free market economics as right-wing, there's just simply no way a sort of a visitor from Mars wouldn't say fascism was a phenomenon of the left, right? And you can look at that from the things that Mussolini himself said, you can kick me out of the Socialist Party, but I'll go to my death a socialist. He always believed he was one of the most important socialist intellectuals of early 20th century Europe. But there's another way to do it. You can actually go back and see what people at the time were saying about fascism. And this has annoyed a lot of people because that's one of the things I did. And I went back and I looked at what American progressives had to say about fascism in the 1920s. Now it's important to keep in mind that fascism in the 1920s is a slightly different beast than the Nazism you get from the Holocaust. What people tend to do is play the movie backwards. They say, oh, the Holocaust, and then anything that comes, the movie starts with the Holocaust, and then anything that sort of comes after must be just as evil, but it doesn't work that way. For example, the Italian Fascist Party was not anti-Semitic. Jews were overrepresented in the Italian Fascist Party from 1920 to 1938 when the Germans forced Italy to basically do its bidding. Mussolini denounced Nazism for the first 10 years of Italian fascism as racist. Jews were also overrepresented in anti-fascist parties, but my point is that our association of fascism with genocidal racism really it's very simplistic. It doesn't really apply to the reality. This is not to say that fascism was good. Lots of things can be bad without being genocidally anti-Semitic, right? That's a pretty low bar. So anyway, I went back and I looked to see what progressives had to say about fascism. Lo and behold, they loved it. The New Republic, the flagship journal of today American liberalism, then American progressivism, founded by the author of The Promise of American Life, Herbert Croly. Herbert Croly was in many ways, the Promise of American Life was really the Bible of American progressivism. In many ways it launched American progressivism. Herbert Croly had a full-on man crush on Benito Mussolini. Defended Mussolini from all critics left and right for 10 years in the pages of the New Republic. Charles Beard, probably the most important economic historian of the 20th century, certainly of the left, hugely influential in our understanding. Basically, he's the origin of this whole theory that the founding fathers were just a bunch of racist white male capitalists who want to protect their own property, right? That basically comes from Charles Beard. And Charles Beard celebrated Mussolini and fascism vociferously in the pages of the New Republic, saying it was this exciting new experiment, this wonderful new option that we needed to emulate here at home. Lincoln Steffens, famous on the right for going to the Soviet Union, the famous muckraking journalist. He goes to the Soviet Union, he comes back, and he says, I've seen the future and it works, right? And he did do that. People seem to forget, though, that the year before he had gone to fascist Italy and said pretty much the exact same thing. In fact, Lincoln Steffens routinely referred to the Russian-Italian method because he saw Bolshevism and fascism as basically the same thing. And so that alone sort of disproves this idea that people thought these things were opposites back then. This idea that fascism and Bolshevism were opposites would have seemed completely bizarre to the people who were observing these developments in their own age. It's not to mean they weren't rivals. Lots of my critics say, Goldberg doesn't know what he's talking about because the communists and the Nazis hated each other. Well, so what? The reality is that most of the real hatreds in life come from groups that are really similar. Turks versus Greeks, Palestinians versus Israelis, right? You hear all this nonsense about, if we only increased understanding, there'd be more peace. Well, last I checked, the Israelis and Palestinians understand each other really, really well. And they have some problems with each other. And the Israelis and the Bolivians don't understand each other at all, and they're getting along just fine. The reality is, if you go and you look at the actual history of this, huge numbers of people switch back and forth between brown shirts and black shirts. It was Coke versus Pepsi, fighting for the hearts and mind of the new, the young, the radicals, the revolutionaries. The old guard, the traditionalists, and certainly the Democrats, were hated by both the browns and the whites. The Communist Party in the Reichstag voted in lockstep with the Nazi Party in the Reichstag, in part because they went by the slogan, first brown, then red. So anyway, they're not opposites. Anyway, so Lincoln Steffens has this, love affair with Mussolini. He says Italy was formed out of Mussolini's rib and all sorts of stony stuff. Ida Tarbell, probably the most famous muckraking journalist of the Progressive era, the woman who brings down Standard Oil. The State Department didn't want to give her a visa to go to Italy. She goes to Italy anyway, and she comes back just writing these incredibly glowing reviews about what a wonderful place, what a wonderful job Mussolini is doing. The title of my book comes from a speech that H.G. Wells gave in 1932, think of that year, to the young liberals at Oxford, where he was asked to define and explain his ideology and what he thought was the course that progressivism and liberalism needed to take in the second half of the 20th century. And people think of H.G. Wells now just basically a kind of cool science fiction writer. They forget that he was arguably the most influential public intellectual in the English-speaking world in the first third of the 20th century. Hugely influential in the social gospel movement here in the United States. One of the founders of Fabian socialists. Hugely influential among progressives. Throughout the 1930s, met with FDR as if it was a papal visit. Front page stories about how H.G. Wells basically laid his hands on FDR and declared he's the ultimate culmination of what Wells called the world brain. Don't get me started on the world brain. Anyway, so H.G. Wells is asked to give this speech at Oxford in 1932. And he says, I've been struggling for my entire life to come up with a label for what I believe. And I finally figured it out. This is what we need to do. This is what liberals need to do. We need to embrace liberal fascism. Or, he also said we need to embrace enlightened Nazism. I guess I could have called my book that and really made a lot of friends. But again, the idea that these things were opposites didn't occur to these people, right? These were linked and kindred phenomena. My favorite one of these was Will Rogers, who was declared the ambassador at large for the American Press Corps. He was sent to Europe to do a sort of fact-finding, well-wish tour. And he goes over, comes back, the New York Times meets him on the pier in New York Harbor, and he says, Mr. Rogers, what do you think of Mussolini? And Will Rogers says, that is somewhat. I am really high on that bird. And his words, not mine. So anyway, why did American progressives think so highly of fascism? And here's where I disagree with some of my colleagues on the right, particularly in many ways Anthony Schley's, who wrote a wonderful book, highly recommend the book, called The Forgotten Man, about the New Deal and this mythology about how the New Deal ended the Great Depression. The New Deal simply prolonged the Great Depression. But she argues that the brain trusters, the progressives, the New Dealers, they got these ideas from the Soviet Union. And she lays out a pretty good case for it. I mean, I know the case, I've looked into a lot of this, but it's only part of the story. It's absolutely true the progressives like the Soviet Union. And you can actually argue that the progressives like the Soviet Union more than they like fascist Italy. I have no problem with that. But they did see fascist Italy and the Soviet Union as similar experiments. That was the watchword of the day, experiment. We need more experimentation, Deweyan pragmatic experimentation, where we sort of slough off democratic capitalism and give the guys with the slide rules and, in the blueprints, control over the economy. The guy who coins the phrase the New Deal, Stuart Chase, actually called for an explicit economic dictatorship where people could still have democracy, just not having any when it comes to things like economics. But the inspiration wasn't the Soviet Union, and it wasn't fascist Italy. It is, in fact, what happened here at home. The progressives loved what Woodrow Wilson did during World War I. They thought Woodrow Wilson's war socialism was the wave of the future. And they were inspired by what William James, the founder of American pragmatism, called the moral equivalent of war. We've all heard that phrase. He's the one who coins it. And basically, people who've emphasized the militarism of fascism, obviously there was a lot of militarism to fascism, but they don't understand the ideological valences of it. Militarism was incredibly popular long before the fascists and the Nazis came along. As early as the 1890s, it was hugely popular because in much the same way that people these days think we should copy FedEx because they have the best business model and the government should be like FedEx and all that kind of thing. You hear Newt Gingrich, my wife works for, talk about that all the time. Back then, William James argued, and everyone agreed with him, that the military was the most successful, impressive social organization imaginable, and that all of society should be like the military. We should have industrial armies where people are simply drafted out of school, conscripted into the labor force for 30 years and then given a pension. This idea ran rampant throughout American progressive circles. This understanding of militarism, this idea of the moral equivalent of war, that all society, because war brings out the best in us, the most organized, disciplined aspects of people, and if only we could find the moral equivalent of war that would allow us to organize society in this regimented way, things would be great. And they got their wish with World War I. World War I was like it was waiting to happen for these progressives. And the progressives were very honest. Yes, they supported the foreign policy aims of Woodrow Wilson and all that kind of stuff, but that's not where it was at for them. What they really loved was this moral equivalent of war stuff at home. What they really loved was the idea that they could somehow crush laissez-faire capitalism. John Dewey, the most important liberal philosopher of the 20th century, coined the phrase, the social benefits of war. This is why he supported World War I, because of the social benefits of war, the ability to crush individualism and free association, the ability to get Americans to drop their particular individualistic ambitions and rally around the state for one common goal, for a cause larger than themselves, as we often hear these days. According to Dewey, the war, this was his argument in favor of the war would require Americans to, quote, give up much of our economic freedom. We shall have to lay by our good-natured individualism and march instead. That's the liberal philosopher saying. If the war went well, he said, it would, quote, constrain the individualistic tradition and convince Americans of the, quote, supremacy of public need over private possessions. Another progressive put it more succinctly, laissez-faire is dead, long live social control. And this is one of the reasons why I argue in my book that Woodrow Wilson was the first, if not fascist dictator in Western civilization, and the first would-be fascist dictator in Western civilization. And all I'll ask you to do again is sort of do the visitor from Mars test, do the duck test. What, in your mind, looks like a fascist dictator, right? We hear the left all the time calling George Bush a fascist dictator. Well, even if you were going to concede the sand-poundingly stupid arguments that they use to make these points, if you're at all objective, you would still have to concede that Woodrow Wilson makes George W. Bush look like a lapsed Unitarian. I mean, Woodrow Wilson was a theocratic, totalitarian-minded, dictatorial guy, power-hungry beyond all reasoning, in love of power for its own sake. He loved Woodrow Wilson. I mean, he loved Abraham Lincoln for the same reason that Herbert Crowley loved Abraham Lincoln. Not because of wanting to free the slaves, but because of Abraham Lincoln's use of war powers to centralize the country. Woodrow Wilson was, in fact, the most racist president of the 20th century. He's the one who brings Jim Crow back to Washington, D.C. Get into all of that. But anyway, so think about what a fascist dictator looks like. Here are some things that you should know about Woodrow Wilson. One of the things that we all think of a fascist dictator or a fascist society are thugs, right? Goons who skirt the line between criminality and ideological enforcers, right? Brown shirts, black shirts. Well, under Woodrow Wilson, the Department of Justice created the American Protective League, which at its height had 250,000 members who were often given badges under cover of authority of the state, beat people up in public, conducted mass arrests, conducted interrogations, wiretapped, all in the name of supporting the regime. Censorship. We've never seen censorship before or since, like we saw under Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson closed scores of newspapers and magazines, threatened to close hundreds more. Propaganda. The first propaganda ministry in Western civilization was created by Woodrow Wilson. It was the first modern one. The Committee for Public Information, which had nearly between 75,000 and 100,000 propaganda agents who dispersed across society, infiltrating movie theaters, carnivals, plays, hotel lobbies, wherever people gathered. And they would foment hatred of Germans, hatred of the enemy, blind loyalty to Woodrow Wilson. The Committee on Public Information produced thousands of propaganda leaflets, books, pamphlets, movies, what have you, all in ways that the Germans and the Italians picked up on later. The War Industries Board, you'll hear people who really don't know anything about fascism, like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., talk constantly about how fascism is just what big business and big government get together. And he's basically right about that to a certain extent, but he doesn't understand the significance of what he's talking about. That's what the New Deal was, and that's what the War Industries Board under Woodrow Wilson was. The War Industries Board was a system by which big industry and big government got down together and tried to socialize the economy, guarantee profits for themselves, screw all the independent businessmen, screw the middle class, screw anybody but themselves, and sort of want to standardize the economy for their own gain. The living Constitution, which is something that Barack Obama, Al Gore, Bill Clinton all expressly supported time and time again. The living Constitution is this idea that basically the Constitution means whatever the organic leader of the state says it means, right? Or in our case, whatever 5 priests on the Supreme Court says it means. But Woodrow Wilson, we should remember, is the author of basically our modern concept of the living Constitution. He was the first president in United States history to openly campaign against the Constitution, saying it was no longer relevant, needed to be thrown away, needed to be replaced with an organic Constitution that responded to the needs of the age. And Woodrow Wilson imposed the income tax, but I just don't like the income tax, so we don't need to get into all that. And so all of this was empowered and supported under this idea of the moral equivalent of war. And it predates all the stuff about Bolshevism, all the stuff about fascism. Jane Addams wrote in 1902 that we must demand that the individual shall be willing to lose the sense of personal achievement and shall be content to realize his activity only in connection to the activity of the many. The social gospel founder Walter Rauschenbusch said in 1896, new forms of association must be created. Our disorganized, competitive life must pass into an organic, cooperative life. Elsewhere, he said, more simply, individualism means tyranny, which is in fact a lesson your kids have gotten in college and will get in college for the foreseeable future, where individualism is basically now treated as code for racism and fascism. It really is Orwellian newspeak that individualism could be seen as code for fascism. Now, the progressives were fascistic in other ways, in ways that we associate with fascism. They were soaked to the bone racists and eugenicists. They were warmongering jingoists. They were theocratic bullies. In fact, the roots of the modern welfare state are largely racist. Not entirely, but largely racist. E.A. Ross, one of the most important intellectuals of his day, sort of summarized the support for the minimum wage in fairly clear terms. He said, look, the coolie, meaning the Chinese worker, right? The coolie cannot outdo the American, but he can underlive him. This was the argument for, if you had a high enough minimum wage, no white employer in his right mind would hire black people or Chinese people or Hispanic people. They would just hire white men because they knew they would get more value for it. And that was the argument that was offered for it. And we have evidence of these sorts of things living on until today, not just the fact that we have the minimum wage, even though it's not justified in racist terms anymore, but the prevailing wage standard that was passed under the New Deal for unions, that you basically have to hire unions and local unions, that was explicitly designed to keep black workers out of the workforce. But I don't have time to get into all of that. What I'm trying to get at in the context of today is just simply this. We live in this age now where progressive just means good, right? Ooh, it's progressive music, you have to listen to the words. It's progressive coffee, it's got to be really good coffee. Fascist just simply means evil, right? And Orwell noticed this as early as 1946. In Politics in the English Language, he said, fascism has simply come to mean anything not desirable. And in contemporary life today, there's an even better working definition of a fascist. A fascist is just simply a conservative who's winning an argument, right? And I'm not here to defend fascism, right? I despise them both. I don't like collectivism. I don't like totalitarianism. I went to Rodolph Scholem Day School. I don't want to, for a moment, be talking about trying to minimize the important moral significance of the Holocaust or any of that kind of stuff. But it's at least worth reminding people from time to time that socialism, right? Socialism, not fascism. Socialism is responsible for the organized industrial scale murder of more people than were killed in the name of fascism by orders of magnitude. Mao killed 65 million people in the name of socialism. Stalin killed anywhere between, estimates are all over the place, anywhere from 20 to 100 million people in the name of socialism. Pol Pot, Castro. You can go down the list, right? And yet, fascism is considered the ultimate evil, genocidal, whatever. And if I call you a fascist, I'm anathematizing you, as they might say in the Catholic Church, right? You're just a heretic. I no longer have to listen to you. You are, as the Amish might say, shunt, right? You have no place in popular discourse. Shut up and go away. That's why Al Gore says that people who disagree with him on global warming are like Holocaust deniers. That's why he says his critics are like brown shirts, right? It's to say, don't listen to these people. They do not matter. When Al Gore says the time for discussion is over, right? Whether you believe it's fascist or not, it's not democratic. Because in a democracy, the time for discussion is not supposed to ever be over. But I can call you a fascist, and it's automatic that I'm calling you evil. I call you a socialist, well, you're goofy on economics, or you're idealistic, or whatever. And it's a sign of how much the left, or you live in towers. You know, it's a sign. It's a sign of how much the left has controlled the language on it. And I think it's worth pointing out, if you get to the context of today's politics. Today's Democrats and liberals openly say they are progressives, right? They admit it. They say they're progressives. Obama at the University of Wisconsin, where I spoke, was great. It was wonderful at the University of Wisconsin, and talking to them about all the people that these buildings are named after, how they all were incredible racists and eugenicists and all that. It was a lot of fun. Obama's at the University of Wisconsin, and he says, after he wins the Potomac primary, he says, what better place than here at the University of Wisconsin at Madison to reaffirm the principles that our campaign is dedicated to? Now let's give Obama the benefit of the doubt, right? And just assume that he doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. Because those very same progressives, first of all, you know, the Iraq War, you know, they would have just, you know, nukes would still be lobbing, you know, towards the Middle East if those guys are there. But more importantly, the guys at the University of Wisconsin openly fought passionately for laws that would have kept Barack Obama's parents from ever getting married, from ever having it. And the idea that somehow he can say this is really kind of shocking. Or Hillary Clinton on the CNN YouTube debate, she was asked, it was a great little moment, she was asked, you know, what is liberalism and are you a liberal? And Hillary Clinton gave one of these classic Clintonian answers where she wanted credit for a position she doesn't actually hold, right? So she said, well, liberalism used to mean the little guy, standing up for the little guy against big power, big corporations, big government and all that kind of stuff. But now it's come to mean, liberalism has come to mean big government. And that's why I don't call myself a liberal. I call myself a modern progressive, which has deep roots in the American political tradition. Now, imagine, call me crazy, I know I'm just right-wing, knuckle-dragging troglodyte, but imagine if in one of the Republican debates, Mike Huckabee said, you know, someone asked him, are you a conservative, or what is a conservative, and are you one? And Huckabee said, well, you know, conservatism used to mean this, but now it means that, and that's why I don't call myself a conservative. I really call myself a modern Confederate, which has deep meaning in history and tradition in American culture. You know? Something tells me that the New York Times would find this worthy of commenting, right? Something tells me that people say, oh, can't you imagine the connotations and the associations and, you know, the history that he's drawing on, you know, when they get their dresses over their heads about it. But you can call yourself a progressive and it has no political cost whatsoever, no cultural cost whatsoever, right? I call myself a conservative, which has no connection to fascism whatsoever, and I'm immediately labeled close to a crypto-fascist. It is an amazing thing that the culture is so distorted this way. And it's something that is very important to push back on. The second point that I want to sort of wind up with is progressives have never relinquished their commitment to this moral equivalence of war thing. Never. It has been the defining principle of American liberalism for the last 100 years. And remains as alive today as it was back then. The New Deal was explicitly justified on the moral equivalent of war argument. Roosevelt said again and again and again what he was going to do was revive Woodrow Wilson's project that they had during World War I. He was going to do what they did to fight World War I, to fight the Great Depression. And he did. He stayed true to that promise. And that's why the Great Depression took a decade to end. But it was expressly said that it was going to be a moral equivalence of war argument. And I go into great detail about that in the book. But I'll give you one example. Hugh Johnson, the guy who oversees the draft and is a member of the War Industries Board under Woodrow Wilson, General Iron Pants Johnson, who was Times Man of the Year in 1932, maybe 33. He's put in charge of the signature program of the New Deal, the National Recovery Administration, right? The most important part of the New Deal project. And so he moves into his office at the White House, and what does he do? He starts unpacking his stuff, and the first thing he does is he hangs up a portrait of Benito Mussolini on his wall. And no one thought that was a contradiction of any kind. In fact, during the Democratic Convention, he distributed a memo in the sort of tongue-in-cheek from the voice of Mussolini saying that what we really need to do if we want to get our program across is put exile Congress and the Supreme Court to an island for 100 days so we can really get some work done. In the 1960s and 1970s, JFK's politics were expressly a moral equivalent of war argument, trying to revive, pass the baton from the greatest generation to his generation or the new generation. You know, these veterans of World War II who are going to take that passion and apply it in new and exciting ways through things like these moral equivalent of war things like the Peace Corps and all these sorts of things. NASA was expressly a moral equivalent of war argument because it was part of the race against the Soviet Union. The war on poverty, moral equivalent of war on poverty. We're going to make the war on poverty the moral equivalent of war. Jimmy Carter's energy policy from the White House in that adorable sweater of his with the thermostat set low. Jimmy Carter said, we are going to make energy conservation the new, his words, moral equivalent of war. Today, it is all over the place. Time magazine, about 6 months ago, had this great cover, where great in terms of creative, where it photoshopped the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima to have a bunch of soldiers raising a tree. And the argument was that we now have to tackle global warming the way the greatest generation tackled World War II. Of course, in the article, it made it very clear that the new enemy is us. You know, so we're Hitler and Tojo now. But, you know, but the infatuation with using this war stuff was rich. There's a new book out called The Climate Change Challenge and the Failure of Democracy, in which the authors argue that climate change may be such a tough problem that democracy just isn't up to snuff, and maybe we need to get rid of it, which is exactly, not figuratively, exactly the argument that the fascists made in the 1920s and 1930s, that industrial capitalism was too complex, too difficult to deal with it. The rise of mass man was just too much for liberal democracy, for 19th century democracy, for the putrefying corpse of laissez-faire, as George Bernard Shaw and Mussolini like to say. And so we had to embrace this new authoritarian wave of the future. It's the exact same argument today. Tom Friedman said on Meet the Press 2 weeks ago that if global warming is a hoax, he doesn't care because it's such a great hoax in terms of getting Americans to do what they need to do. Time and again, every time there's a problem with the economy, the same argument immediately. It's like Chuck Schumer hits F10 on his computer and prints out this op-ed about how we need a new Deal, right? And it's one new Deal after another. And a new Deal is basically just another way of saying another moral equivalent to war thing. After 9/11, Chuck Schumer said we need a new Deal. After Katrina, William Greider and Chuck Schumer said we needed a new Deal. Now with this credit crisis, we're hearing constantly about how we need a new Deal. Tom Friedman, back up saying, part of it is just this obsession, this weird, twisted, sick envy of authoritarian regimes, right? Tom Friedman on Meet the Press, in the same interview 2 weeks ago, said, he has a whole chapter, this is the title, China for a Day. If only we could be China for a day, you know? If only we could run roughshod over capitalism, run roughshod over democracy, run roughshod over the rule of law, and just impose our will with the right policies. Wouldn't that be nifty, right? You have all of these guys who get so worked up and jealous over the fact that the Chinese banned plastic bags overnight. Wahoo! By all means, let's chuck the Constitution. No more plastic bags. But it's more amazing than that, because capitalism, free market economics, right? Capitalism is a Marxist term. Free market economics, right? Have lifted more people out of poverty, right? Lifted billions out of poverty in the last 30 years alone. They've extended human life beyond anyone's prediction, delivered medical breakthroughs, rising crust frozen pizza, you name it. Amazing things have come from capitalism, right, or from free market economics. They've expanded It's brought out Francis Bacon called the relief of man's estate. They've made us happier, healthier, and more prosperous all around the world. In China, markets have lifted 300 million people out of poverty in the last couple decades. And yet it's amazing, when authoritarian regimes, right, when backwater dictatorial regimes who have immiserated their own people to no end for generations, they just start to adopt free market economics, right? And all of a sudden there's this explosion of progress. Huge numbers of dirt poor people are lifted up into the middle class. And immediately, people like Tom Friedman and all these guys in the West say, it must have been the authoritarianism, right? China adopted free market policies really as a last resort. First, they tried killing 65 million of their own people, right? When free market policies come after murdering 65 million of your own citizens, it seems to me it's pretty fair to say it's the last resort, right? And it works, and then all of a sudden, all these pointy-headed, authoritarian, envying, pointy-headed bandersnatches in the West, so I'm trying to keep this not blue, they say, wow, it must be because they don't have to muck around with democracy. It is an amazing, it really shows you their true colors. In fact, look around the left. Who are the rights heroes? Who are our heroes? It's the guys who wrote the Constitution, the guys who wrote the Bill of Rights. It's Adam Smith and Edmund Burke and Milton Friedman, right? Go on any college campus. Their heroes are Che Guevara, Fidel Castro. It is an amazing, and yet where are the fascists who hate democracy? It is an amazing groupthink that's at work out there. And it's, and it's kind of like this idea that somehow it's the authoritarianism that did it. It's kind of like saying, some criminal, some scumbag who spent his entire life robbing people, murdering people, or ripping off people, doing horrible things, conning people, and then he goes to jail and he finally sort of gets religion. And he finally goes on the straight and narrow, and all of a sudden he starts putting his life together and living a somewhat prosperous, happy, contented life. And it's like saying, gosh, it must have been his street smarts. It is this weird thing that this obsession with the worst things rather than the best things that have come along, which is simply freedom. And I'm going to close on this thought. It's an important thing to remind people. It has been ever thus. This is the permanent fight. It is the eternal fight. I go into great detail in the book about how there's basically the party of Rousseau and the party of Locke. And I use this, I don't want to get into an argument about what they really wrote, instead I'm using this sort of symbolic argument. The Rousseauian view is the collective is more important than the individual. That politics is a religion. That the state is sovereign. That property doesn't matter much. That the collective is in charge and it gets to set the way. The Lockean vision is sort of the opposite. The Lockean vision, or the Smithian vision if you prefer, the Lockean vision is the sovereignty of the individual, the sovereignty of your conscience is first. Rights come from God, not the group. Property and free markets and all of these things are important, and that we are what Locke called captains of our own selves, right? And that the state exists as a transactional relationship. We get together and say, these are the things the state needs to do because we can't do them individually, but then everything else we reserve to ourselves. The Rousseauian vision is the complete opposite. It says the state does everything, and then we decide what you can do, right? That's what when Bill Clinton said, sure, when we had this huge surplus, sure, I could give the money back to the American people, but you might spend it wrong, right? That's the Rousseauian vision. And while I think it explains a lot about objective politics, I think it's also a psychological thing. This division runs through the human heart. We're all a little Rousseauian, we're all a little Lockean. We all want to belong to a group, a tribe, a collective. We all want to have that sense of community that makes us feel like we're recognized and part of a group. And we also want to be recognized for our own individual merit. And this runs through the human heart. And some people are more Rousseauian and some people are more Lockean. And the point I'm trying to make is, you're never going to get rid of it. I go to these events, I give these speeches, people get up and they say, how are we going to fix this? How are we going to stop that? And I always try to tell them, we're not. It's the eternal fight. There are always going to be people who want to impose the Rousseauian vision. Always. And there are going to be more of them than us. Because most people are sort of herd mentality about these things. They don't think seriously about politics. They basically just say that, politics needs to be like my mommy or my daddy or my priest or whatever, and I'm just going to defer to them and follow their orders, and I'll carve out my own little life here, and that's great. And that is sort of the default programming in our minds. We want to live in a tribal society. And I find that encouraging, right? First of all, it's a full employment act for me, right? But it's also a rate to be a happy warrior. Get used to it. This is the fight. It's a good fight. You're on the side of truth and justice, or as Tommy Lee Jones likes to say in Firebird, your heads and your hearts are wired together for some full tilt boogie for freedom and justice. It is a good fight. It is the noble fight. We are on the side of fighting poverty. We are on the side of human freedom. People say, why is there so much poverty in the world? What are these people talking about? We know why there's so much poverty in the world. Poverty is the factory precept of the human condition. We're born in poverty. We're born ignorant, uneducated, naked, penniless, right? And that's so it's true with mankind. We started in caves with nothing. And the question is, why is there wealth? And we know why there's wealth. Because of free markets, of liberal democracy, the rule of law, of the Lockean vision. And so, people say, how are we going to get out of this? How are we going to defeat this? There are no silver bullets. One of my favorite stories is about the physicist who's, giving a speech about the heliocentric nature of the solar system or whatever, and some little old man interrupts him and says, excuse me, Herr Professor, excuse me, doctor, you've got it wrong. The world, it sits on the top of a giant turtle, right? And the physicist is like, what are you talking about? No, it's true. The world sits on a turtle. And the physicist figures he'll indulge him. He says, okay, what does that turtle sit on? And the old man says, another turtle. And the physicist says, rolling his eyes, okay, what is that? And the old man cuts him off and says, let me help you out. It's turtles all the way down. This Lockean versus Rousseauian thing, it's turtles all the way down. It is forever. If it's not this fight against Bill Richardson's monorail, it's going to be the next thing. There's always going to be people who think that capitalism is too chaotic, takes too much power away from those would-be social planners, too much is too confusing, too scary, too risky, and there are going to be other people who are comfortable with it, who recognize its benefits, and that fight is going to go on forever. So be happy warriors, enjoy it. It's the good fight. T.S. Eliot was right when he says there's no such thing as a truly won cause, because there's no such thing as a truly lost cause. It is going to go on forever, and if you can't do it every day, so be it. Take care of your homes, your communities, your families, your businesses. That's where the real progress in this world is made anyway, right? That's where the real important stuff happens. And if you can't be part of the fight every day, give some money to these guys, because they're having this fight every day. Help out where you can and when you can. And enjoy the fact that you're on the right side. And be a happy warrior. Henry V was right. We are that happy few. Anyway, I want to thank you all very much for having me be part of your happy few, and go ahead and say questions. I really want people to come up to the mic. It's not my fault. Sorry. Test.
Can you talk really loud, Rex?
I'll talk loud.
Actually, you don't have to come to the mic anymore.
Well, given that there are no perfect solutions, with this upcoming election, with admittedly flawed candidates, can you still be a happy warrior and vote libertarian?
In case you didn't hear it, the question is, with these two flawed candidates, can you still be a happy warrior and vote libertarian? You could be a happy warrior or be wrong. And look, I understand the frustration with McCain from a libertarian perspective, believe me. And I don't want to get into a conversation about Bob Barr, Look, in a two-party system, it's a binary, right? And objectively, to the extent that a vote for libertarian matters, it's a vote against John McCain. And William F. Buckley in National Review, he had this rule of thumb. He was asked who he's supporting and why. He always said, I'm supporting the most conservative candidate electable. And I have all sorts of objections to the things that John McCain, a lot of things in John McCain's record. But at the same time, he's the most conservative candidate electable, and a lot of these fights are for the primaries. And now it's a choice between Barack Obama and John McCain, or I should say it's a choice between Barack Obama and the other guy, and John McCain and Sarah Palin. And I don't think it's a real hard choice for me. But I understand the libertarian desire. I like having, my attitude towards libertarians has always been sort of the same as English kings towards the Celtic hordes in Ireland. They're incredibly useful for unleashing on your enemies when you never want one on the throne. So I want more power to libertarians, just not too much more power.
First, Jonah, thanks for your daily wisdom on the corner. And your talk illustrated, I think, strongly the disconnect between war fascism, between rhetoric and reality. An important use of propaganda is essential for fascism. Could you comment on the relationship between pre-Socratic sophistry and postmodernism? Because from my humble perspective, it seems like...
Security! Get this crackpot out of here!
It's practical. It seems like Western civilization came out of the chaos of rhetoric by a Pythagoras here. And now, especially if you go to universities, it seems like the idea of objective truth is being happily discarded. And I remember that scene in 1984 where Winston Smith is asked, saying there's no such thing as truth, I can float up in the air. If the party says I'm floating up in the air. And that connection between freedom and an objective reality that we share. Could you comment on that?
Sure.
Yeah, make it applicable for somebody who went to Albuquerque public schools.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the postmodern part, less on the pre-Sophoclean sophistry part. We can do that in the post-breakfast seminar. I think you're right. I mean, look.
Wait, what was the question?
Security! To the extent, I actually wrote a piece in, of all places, USA Today, about how Barack Obama is a postmodernist. He has, first of all, he comes out of that tradition. He goes to the University of, he goes to Harvard, he goes